This story has been translated from Polish. Late in the autumn of 2016, under the chill of a harsh Polish frost, I was involved in a long weekend hike that turned into a minor catastrophe. Myself and 7 others were hiking through the forest, looking for a remote place to camp and to fire off our rifles at paper targets. I settled down under the shade of a hillside and was smoking my pipe when one of our group reported that he had discovered what he referred to as a tiny castle. There are numerous castles scattered across Poland, most resembling what Americans would call a manor, as opposed to anything medieval looking. We chided him and stated that there were no roads here, so how could there be a castle of any kind? We followed him for several minutes through the trees and icy wind, and discovered a small 2-story stone structure, perhaps 10 by 15 feet. The hatchway to the second floor was inaccessible because there were no stairs or ladder, but the ground floor was littered with leaves and rubble, and what looked to be an old animal burrow of some kind. My friend joked that it was a whorehouse for animals, but someone else suggested that we scatter the leaves and examine the floor. Sure enough, after shifting through the debris, we discovered a piece of plywood covering a short stone staircase that led to a room below. The 4 of us went down with our lights and discovered ancient furniture, including a bookcase and a child's rocking horse. Behind the rotting bookcase, we tore cobwebs away and discovered the room was the entrance to a tunnel that ran deep into the forest floor. I did not wish to explore any further. I am a tall man, and I would have been forced to stoop low to walk into the tunnel. The first man stated that we were standing in an escape tunnel from a nearby castle. Horses would be kept in the stone room above, and if the castle's lord chose to flee, he could escape through the tunnel and mount a horse and disappear into the forest. I argued that there was no castle or structure of any kind that was close to us. The nearest to my knowledge was Golhof Castle, a popular tourist attraction, but we were nowhere near that area. From the room above we heard arguing. We returned to discover one of the friends was drunkenly shouting at another. They were arguing over a very large knife that had been discovered plunged blade deep into the dirt. I went back and double-checked, and we discovered that lining the perimeter of the room were 3 other knives, all hilt up, sticking out of the dirt. I examined one, but it was in terribly poor condition. My companion discovered a bridle and switch for whipping a horse, along with another knife in a wooden box across the room. The drunken man stated that we could not remove anything from the stone hut because the blade appeared to be stained with ancient blood and might have been used to end someone's life. He also gave us a superstitious spiel about how the spirit would follow us if we took it. A large argument then ensued, and a few fists were thrown. The fight was ended when the strongest of us took the knife and hurled it up into the hatchway of the second floor, where we heard it clatter out of reach from all of us. 2 of our group wanted to explore the tunnel even further, but the rest of us dismissed this and headed back to camp. They returned later that night without incident, saying that the tunnel had collapsed about a half a mile in, and they could go on no further. Most of the men I never spoke to again after that trip, but in April of 2017, I was contacted by one who had been there with me. He stated the police were soon to approach me. I asked why, but he simply stated that I would learn soon. The knife that had been disputed over was found over 300 miles away on the side of a highway in Lithuania. A 24-year-old Lithuanian girl had been kidnapped, murdered, and robbed of her vehicle on that stretch of road weeks before. After the knife had been found, it was tested for fingerprints, and the 3 of our group were identified. And before long, all names of those who had been present were being shared. I told the authorities that I could not explain how the knife traveled that distance and had been abandoned on that road. I told them what happened that day and gave them the names of the 2 men who went back to explore the tunnel. It was never confirmed that the knife had been used in the death of the young woman, or had any connection to her at all, but I would be interested to know how a knife that was tossed beyond anyone's reach was found in another country months later. There were other knives that could have been taken from the tunnel room instead of going through the trouble to reacquire the one that had been tossed upstairs. Makes me wonder what kind of other extraordinary unexplained coincidences such as this occur on a daily basis. I never got to meet my grandfather. He died in prison in the 90s when I was a kid. But the way my great-uncle tells it, when he was younger, he was absolutely fearless and got away with a lot of crazy stunts all the time. During the 60s, my grandfather and great-uncle lived in Nashville, Tennessee, close to Fort Negli. It has a pretty unique design for an army base. From an aerial view, it looks like a set of spurs. At the time, the interstate was in the process of being constructed, and the fort sat pretty much abandoned and forgotten. My grandfather and great-uncle were wandering around on foot late one night and decided to go check out the fort. They had previously been there with friends during the day, but had never ventured there in the dark. So like the two belligerent numbskulls they were, without flashlights or any kind of plan, they walked across the field to the fort, got around the rudimentary security measures, and entered through the north side. My uncle said that they walked around the parapets, smoked some cigarettes, and drank whatever my grandfather had in his flask at the time. He stated that they weren't making any attempt to be stealthy or hidden. They were just meandering around like they owned the place, not taking into account any of the historical significance of the building they were trespassing in, or how many had died there. If either of them had tripped and broken a limb or fallen off one of the walls, they would have been completely screwed, because the nearest phone was 10 minutes away running distance at best. At the time, the building was about 100 years old, and anything small of any historical value that was easy to pocket had been taken long ago. My uncle stated that it never once crossed his mind that they may not be alone in there. After a while, my uncle had to piss, but at least had the courtesy to not do it so openly inside the fort. He left the inner courtyard and went outside. But my grandfather was checking out the tunnels on the south side and wasn't ready to leave just yet. After his piss, he returned to the courtyard and called out for his brother, but wasn't able to find him anywhere. Worried that he may have fallen and hurt himself, he began to walk around in the shadows under the parapets, hoping to bump into him in case he was unconscious in the dark. He walked around the perimeter and checked what dark corners he could. He wasn't eager to go down into the tunnels because he knew he wouldn't be able to see a thing. After what he guessed was close to 10 minutes, he had an idea. He called out as loud as he could, "Shit! The cops are coming!" There was a scuffling sound from the darkness. Then my grandfather came running out of the shadows, shouting at my uncle to run. They left the fort, jumped the fence, and took off towards the nearest stretch of road. My grandfather later reported that he had been hearing movement the entire time the two were there, and foolishly decided to go investigate on his own. He figured that someone may have been stalking them, and he wanted to get the drop on whoever it was, but he couldn't do that as long as he was with my uncle. Like a ninja, he snuck into the shadows around the entrance to the tunnel. He located a stranger and then made to tackle them. But in the next moment, he felt a cold gun barrel press against his neck. The figure didn't say anything. He stated that he suspected the stranger was a woman, but only because the figure was shorter and seemed to have longer hair. The stranger backed him into a wall and kept him at gunpoint the entire time my uncle was looking for him, almost as though it was waiting for him to leave. When he called out that the cops were coming, the stranger must have panicked, because my grandfather heard the click of the gun as the hammer fell, but there was no gunshot. Thinking quickly, my grandfather struck the stranger in the face. He then heard the gun fall onto the ground, but he didn't try to find it in the dark. He just sprinted out of the shadows and was terrified about being shot in the back. My great-uncle can't confirm any of this, as he never saw another person or heard anything. He stated that my grandfather was clearly shaken as they made their way home. He guessed the gun had misfired. They never reported it to the cops. My grandfather went on to say that if my uncle had left without him, he may very well have been killed. There is this old, abandoned World War II cargo ship floating out in Homebush Bay in Australia, west of Sydney. It is called the SS Airfield, and it literally has a forest growing inside of it. Quick backstory. It was decommissioned after the war and was transported to the bay to be broken down for scrap. And while it floated around, a hollow shell, nature decided to reclaim the husk as its own. An army of mangrove trees has sprouted inside, completely overwhelming the ship, making it a literal floating forest. It's one of those weird but beautiful freak happenstances of nature, which shows us how something old and useless can become amazing and inspiring, and how Mother Nature always finds a way to thrive in our absence. It's a major tourist attraction, and shutterbugs visit it constantly to take pictures of the metal island floating against the backdrop of the city. And that's where my story starts. To the best of my knowledge, it isn't exactly illegal to visit the airfield up close, but you better believe if the authorities caught you, they would assume that you were going to vandalize it or burn the whole thing down. I'm sure if you wanted to try and climb aboard, you probably could find a way, but it wouldn't exactly be easy or practical. The vegetation in there is just way too thick. So when my friends and I visited, we paddled up in my friend's boat and had some beers before tossing the cans up into the mess of trees. Kind of a dick thing to do, but that was our way of planting a flag, I suppose. None of us ever actually tried to climb aboard the airfield, which is why a few years ago, to our great confusion, we noticed a figure standing on top of the rusted spike at the front of the ship. Now keep in mind, this was about 2 a.m, so it was pretty dark out. As we were rowing in close, we kept speculating out loud to each other. Wait, is someone actually there? You're seeing that too, right? We called out half-heartedly to the figure, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves, but also seeking verification. Now the reason we assumed it was actually a person was because we had seen the airfield both up close and at a distance about a dozen times, and something about the way the bow looked that night caught our eye. Like someone was perched on top of it. We only had the light of the moon to go by. We obviously weren't going to row our boat much closer. If it was a person, we didn't want to get within range of them being able to crash down upon us. After a few minutes, we shrugged it off. If it was really a person up there, they weren't responding to our calls. One of my friends suggested that it might have been a mannequin someone had stuck up there as a joke. We decided to steer clear of the airfield altogether just to be safe. We did a full rotation around in the boat, and once we came to the other side, the first thing we noticed was that whoever, or whatever had been standing on the point, was now gone. The strange shape had seemingly vanished. None of us recalled hearing a splash, as if something had jumped or fallen, so being slightly more panicked than perhaps we should have been, we made for shore. Our guess was that someone really was on the airfield either messing with us or trying to avoid us. Either way, we all wanted no part of it. It was a very vulnerable feeling, being out there in the dark, fully exposed on the water. One of my friends said the word ghost out loud, but that didn't make the situation feel any more or less safe. We were about halfway to shore when my friend at the very back of the boat started screaming, and he nearly leapt fully to his feet. "There's a hand! There's a fucking hand!" We all immediately looked back, and through the flurry of activity, I saw the wake of something in the water moving away from us, back towards the direction of the abandoned ship. My friend grabbed one of the paddles and smacked at the water behind us, as if he was trying to strike at something. We asked him what the hell he was talking about, and he stated that he had leaned over, and his elbow had brushed into a hand that was holding on to the back of our boat, and when he had spun around, he noticed an arm retracting itself and disappearing back into the water. We all called bullshit on him, but he was clearly terrified, and as soon as we got to the shore, he immediately left the boat. After he pulled the boat back up and loaded it on top of the car, he had calmed down a bit and stated that both the hand and the arm appeared to be human, as if someone was letting us tow them back to shore. Now, I had a couple of issues with this alleged underwater hitchhiker, and I told him so. First of all, no one with any concern for their own well-being would swim in the bay, as a result of all the chemicals, oil, and coal that had once contaminated the water. Secondly, had someone actually ducked their head underwater and took off swimming away from our boat, why would they head back to the airfield instead of making for the shore? While a few of us had noticed something under the water, none of us had seen or heard anything else breach the surface, like someone coming up for air. I glanced around the immediate area, looking for another car nearby in case someone was scuba diving, but as far as I could tell, we were completely alone. After we attached the boat to the car and everyone piled in, I glanced behind me and looked back at the water. By the glow of the car's taillights, I noticed what appeared to be a figure of a man standing hip-deep in water, standing just as still as the figure we saw on the airfield. I felt a shock of panic rocket down my spine, but I didn't react. I didn't say anything at all. I didn't look back as we left the bay in the darkness behind us. I was probably just seeing things.
There's always a reason to be afraid.